Today we're going to go over interval quality. This is one of the concepts that confuses a lot of people, even in undergraduate theory classes. This is one that people get really mixed up about and can think about in some really interesting ways. One of the first things we want to get into with interval quality is we'll talk about the basic idea. We're going to be taking our intervals that we learned before, the interval numbers, the second, and now getting more specific about the sound of these intervals and then how they would be used in chord and scalar material. We'll be using the terms major, minor, diminished, augmented, and perfect. On page 1 here, we are going to be dealing with major intervals first. These are the intervals that occur within the major scale on scale degrees 2, 3, 6, and 7. As we get into this, one of the big things you have to throw out, enharmonics don't matter. We are simply reading note to note what is the interval from this letter to this letter, and then measuring from either the major or the perfect interval. And so for our first one over here, we start on a C. This is the lower tone, so we want to use the C major scale to now measure the interval. So in a C major scale, we would go C, D. This C to D right here is our major second. A minor second is always a half step lower than the major. The diminished will always be a half step lower than the minor. So we have to call this D double flat because even though this is enharmonic to C, D double flat is a visually different note than a C. And so to make a diminished second, we need to physically write D, C to D double flat to get a diminished second. And now the augmented second is related to the major, as augmented intervals are always a half step larger than the major. So if C to D is major, then C to D sharp is our augmented second. Now we'll go on to the next line where we have our thirds. We notice C is no longer the lower tone. Between the two of these, D is now my lower tone. So we're not thinking about the D major scale. Looking for a third, the first ranks of our D major scale, D, E, F sharp. So to get a major third, I would need the F sharp. Going from minor to major needs to be a half step lower, so F sharp going down to F natural. If it helps us, we can put that in, but we would not need the natural sign here. Diminished is a half step smaller than minor. So here, F natural would need to go down to F flat. And now for the augmented third, this would need to be a half step larger than the major. So F sharp would go up to F double sharp, and this is the symbol for the double sharp. Now we're going on to the major sixth. Now we notice out of these two notes, the E flat is the lower tone. We need to think about the notes of our E flat major scale. E flat, F, G, A flat, B flat, C. And so this C is my major sixth. I would have my minor sixth be a half step lower. My diminished sixth would be a half step lower than the minor and a whole step lower than the major. And now my augmented sixth is the half step larger than the major. So my C going up to C sharp. Finally, here we have the last of our major intervals that we're talking about. We have our major seventh. And so we think about now out of these notes, the G is the lower tone as we go from G to F. We think about our G major scale. G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, G. This would be to be an F sharp to be considered a major seventh inside the G major scale. The minor seventh is a half step lower. F sharp goes down to F natural. Diminished seventh is a half step smaller. F natural goes down to F flat. And the augmented seventh is a half step larger than the major, so F sharp would go up to F double sharp. Now we're going to be going on to the other intervals. As we know, as we've skipped a few scale degrees, we've skipped a few parts of the scale. And now we're talking about the perfect intervals. The perfect intervals are on the repeated note prime, fourth, the fifth, and the octave, as these have a different sound and also a different rule to them. Perfect intervals can only be perfect. Either they go from perfect, and as soon as they are a half step smaller, they become diminished. As soon as they become a half step larger, they become augmented. Let's start off with the perfect fourth, and we'll come back and do we'll do the prime afterwards. We'll see why in a second. We'll start off with our perfect fourth. Over here, we have two notes. Once again, our first note is the lower note F, so we're using our F major scale. F, G, A, B flat. And now there is no minor fourth. So we go a half step down from the perfect fourth, and we are now sitting at our diminished fourth, being a half step lower. B flat goes down a half step to B double flat. And now, when we go to augmented, augmented is a half step above the perfect. So B flat would go up a half step to B natural. Now, let's backtrack, and we'll see why the prime is the least common interval you have to deal with, especially in piano music. We don't talk about this interval nearly as much. It also has something weird we'll see in a second. And so the perfect prime is 0 half steps. It is a repeated note. So here we have our C to C would be a perfect prime, or a perfect unison, as you might also hear it called. And so over here, if I want to make that a half step bigger, I would go from C to C sharp, as I now have 1 half step here for my augmented prime, my perfect prime going up a half step to my augmented prime. Now you might think that the diminished prime would go down a half step like we've been doing. But here's the interesting thing. Now we know that we have our C and our C flat. But we have to now think, which one is the lower tone? My C natural is now higher than my C flat. So my C flat is the lower tone. So now I'm analyzing the other way, saying C flat to C natural, which we'll notice here, if I had C flat to C flat, would be a perfect prime. This one is a half step larger. So right over here, we would actually have an augmented prime, as now we are evaluating this off of the lower tone C flat. And trust me, this will almost never come up in life. This was truly just test material. This would be a trick question on a test. It's a hard one to get right. Thing to keep in mind, though, is when we deal with intervals here, the perfect fourth is 5 half steps. Diminished fourth would be 4 half steps. The augmented fourth would be 6 half steps. They are 1 half step smaller and 1 half step larger. When we deal with a perfect prime, it is 0 half steps. The augmented prime is 1 half step. A diminished prime can't have negative 1 half step, which is why, in a theoretical sense, diminished primes can't exist. As we're not talking about algebra, we're not talking about math here. It simply is that we would then analyze off the lower note, because there is now 1 half step difference between them. And so we have a prime, and there's a half step space between them. It is an augmented prime. So now let's get more normal. So the rest of them are more normal. This is the weird one. Let's go on to fifths. We have 2 notes. Our lower note is the B. So we can think about our B major scale. We have our B, C sharp, D sharp, E, F sharp. And so my perfect fifth is the F sharp. And so to make a diminished fifth, I need to be a half step smaller. And so F sharp goes down a half step to F natural. For the augmented fifth, I need to be a half step larger. So my F sharp goes up to F double sharp. And finally, we have the perfect octave, or the perfect eighth. You'll almost always hear this called the perfect octave, especially for piano. We talk about octaves. We don't call these eighths. And so we have our E as the lower note. We also have an E as our higher note, as that's where it gets this special name as prime and octave, referring to when the letter name repeats, either with the unison tone or the octave tone. And so, yep, big thing to check here is octave. A perfect octave should repeat the exact same note. So we do have a perfect octave here from E to E. The diminished octave is a half step smaller. So E goes down to E flat, and the augmented octave would go up a half step from E to E sharp. And now, before we wrap up, like I said, we have to really just ignore the concept of enharmonics when we deal with this, as there's probably some people that are getting confused and saying, like over here, oh my gosh, but D to F double sharp looks weird, and F double sharp sounds like a G, and that is the key for G, so this should be a perfect fourth. No, a perfect fourth is a fourth. It would be going like here, from D to G. That would be our fourth. We are seeing this visually written as a third, and it has a double sharp, so we would say that this is an augmented third. We are identifying the interval, we are taking accidentals and eventually key signature into consideration, and figuring out what is the name of this distance on the staff. These interval qualities really are coming into effect when we are dealing with written music. When you are just identifying intervals on the piano and there is no written component to it, you can talk about whatever interval is most simple for you. But as soon as we are dealing with a written note on the staff, that is when these interval qualities really come to be important, as it can drastically change the spelling of a chord, or it can drastically change the spelling of a scale to help us better understand our music and be able to better memorize and understand what the composer's intentions were. Let's now go over more of the definition of what it means for an interval to be perfect, major, or minor. And so, over here, we've got three different sounds: dissonant, consonant, and perfect. The term I like to use for these is tonal identities. Is when we have an interval with two different notes, especially when they're played together, they make a certain sound, and we can hear either the perfect over here with two repeated notes sounds very hollow. We call that perfect. The notes rub against each other, they're in disagreement, we call that dissonance. And when the notes ring, they're in agreement, we call that consonance. And so we'll start off with our perfect prime, where we have our C, and it stays exactly the same. And then over here, we'll hear the two C's together. And this is a great example of a perfect interval, as we hear hollowness. In this case, we actually hear no extra vibrations from it, and so we put the perfect prime in the perfect category. Now, we'll go to our major and minor second. So if I had a major second, I would have my C to D, a second. And the second, in C major scale, meaning this is the major second. On this harmonic major second, we hear this rub between the two notes. This is our dissonance, where the notes are coming to a disagreement. And if it was a minor second, we'd actually notice even more. Which goes to show where we have a second, and the fact that it's major or minor means that the second, regardless of which version, will be dissonant either way. Two different kinds of dissonance, but the second will always be dissonant, whether it is major or minor. Now we'll go to our thirds. From C to E in our C major scale, our major third. And we notice it has this nice ringing sound to it. And so that would put it in the consonant category. Even if I was playing this to an E flat for a minor third, still has a nice ringing quality to it. So regardless if a third is major or minor, it still has this consonant identity. And so we notice then the third has the tonal identity of consonance, a second has the tonal identity of dissonance. Next we'll go on to our perfect fourth. C to F would be our fourth, and these are both natural in our C major scale, so this would be our perfect fourth. And so now we get into our perfect fourth, and we notice it has this hollow ringing sound to it, which would put it in the perfect category. We're noticing why this perfect category is named what it is these intervals are the ones that have the P in front of them. Gives us a hint for other perfect intervals to come, where consonants and dissonants, they are marked with major and minor symbols. As there is more than one way to be consonant or dissonant, there's only one way for a perfect interval to create its hollow sound. It's a very specific set of half steps. We'll go on to our fifth. C to G is our fifth, and in the C major scale, that is the fifth, so this would be our perfect fifth. And so it goes in that perfect category. Now we get into our sixth. Starting off with our major sixth, C to A. Do you think that sounds consonant or dissonant? That six has that nice ringing tone, and so we do put it in the consonant category. The tonal identity of a sixth is to be consonant. We can even take it into a minor sixth, lowering it a half step, and it still remains that consonant identity. Now we go to our seventh. C to B is our seventh. Since it is in the C major scale, this would be our major seventh. And that rub that's created, the fact that it wants to be there's another note that wants to resolve this tension, is what would make this dissonant. Even if I change this to a B flat, it still has this dissonant rub to it, meaning the tonal identity of a seventh is to be dissonant. And finally, we know what this one's going to be. We have our perfect octave. And has the hollow, ringing, perfect quality to it. And so, here's where I'm going to move this one over here, and we get to notice a pattern where we'll notice our two dissonant intervals, the second and the seventh, add up to the number 9. Our consonant intervals, third and sixth, also add up to 9. Here we have our fourth and our fifth, once again, adding up to 9. And our perfect octave and our prime, which could also be represented with the number 1, 8 plus 1, also adds up to 9. And so, what we're about to go over is called the rule of nines, of why this relationship works. So I'll go over here to my dissonant interval first, my seventh and my second. Over here, I have my major seventh. And so now, if I was to take my two C's and flip them the other way, you'll notice we now get seconds. I invert them. So either way, if we have C and B, it'll always be a dissonant interval created between a C and a B, regardless if it is a seventh or inverted to a second. Now here's the interesting thing here. We have our C to B is a major seventh. When I invert this interval, using the rule of nines, we'll also flip the quality. So now we have the C, we have the B, the C, and since now B is our lower tone, we would use a B major scale, and the C is that half step lower than the C sharp in the scale. Also, we have our half step right here from B to C, our minor second. And so a minor second would invert to a major seventh. A major seventh inverts to a minor second. We can do the same thing now with our thirds and our sixth. When we have our C to E, we have our major third. And now, if I was to flip this and invert the interval, you'll notice now we are left with our sixth. Now E is our bass tone. We use our E major scale. E, F sharp, G sharp, A, B, and it should be a C sharp for the major sixth. Since this is a half step lower, this is our minor sixth. Our major third inverted to a minor sixth. We can take that minor sixth inverted back, and we are left with a major third. Once again, we can use that rule of 9 and then flip the quality from major to minor. Now we get over here into our other perfect intervals. We'll start off with our fourth. I have my perfect fourth. I invert this interval, and I get my perfect fifth. As if I have an F now, my fifth of the F major scale, F, G, A, B flat, C. A perfect interval does not have a counterpart to it, so when it's inverted, it will remain perfect. When I take my perfect fifth, we'll notice the opposite comes, where I get that fifth, inverts to a perfect fourth, and finally, when we get our octave, it'll do the same thing. Perfect octave, and my perfect prime occurring out of that when I invert these intervals, always adding up to 9, with the perfect intervals remaining perfect even when inverted. Now, we can learn more about what the diminished and augmented term means. And so, let's start off now with one of the ones that confuses people when they get into this, which is if I have some accidentals thrown in here that people get a bit spooked about. And so, now, on the music here, we have a C to D. Gives us into our second category. And so, C to D natural was our major second, D flat was our minor second, and now D double flat would be our diminished second. Now let's listen to it. But a lot of people will notice D double flat would be enharmonic with C. So a lot of people think, oh, this is a prime interval. No, because of how it's written on the music, we still have a second represented in our music. And so this would be an example of diminished seconds have the quality of a perfect interval. So when an interval becomes diminished, it loses its tonal identity. The second is no longer dissonant. It now takes over another tonal identity, such as perfect. When I invert it, this might be hard for people to see, but over here, I invert it, I now have D double flat to C. A lot of people that are like, will say, I do not know my D double flat major scale. Great thing is we don't need to. If I know my rule of 9, I can figure this out through the inversion. If I have C to D double flat is a diminished second, this will invert to a seventh, and the diminished will move to an augmented. Meaning over here, I now have an augmented seventh. As now, this flat has pushed it too wide, becoming further than a major seventh, pushing it into the fact of being into this perfect quality, sounding like a perfect octave, but written as a seventh, the augmented seventh. Good, we'll do a few more of those. And so one of the examples we see a lot in our music. And so we have over here a fourth from C to F. From C to F, we would now be pushing this F up a half step from its perfect interval. This is now our augmented fourth. That rub is now dissonant. We'll notice that the fourth no longer has its tonal identity of being perfect. It is now a dissonant sounding interval, which is why we give it the term augmented. Augmented meaning it has been pushed outside of its tonal identity by being too wide. We can invert this interval, and we'll notice now from F sharp to C, we have our fifth. Normally, we would have an F sharp major scale, F sharp, G sharp, A sharp, B, C sharp. This is a half step too small. We are given our diminished fifth, as now we have a fifth that is too small to be perfect, and it now has its dissonant quality. Hopefully this gives more of an understanding of why we use the term major and minor for seconds, sevenths, thirds, and sixths, where the word perfect comes from, but also a bit more understanding to why intervals become diminished and augmented, and what those words mean for how our music sounds and what the intervals are trying to represent. Finally, we have a great resource here in musictheory.net. We can go into the exercises tool, and there are a couple really good ones for interval quality. First, we'll go into staff construction, and we'll go into interval construction. We'll still check some settings. Here, we'll go into using the grand staff, make our range the typical reading range for pianists, which is going to be the high C and the low C. We definitely want to make sure require quality is turned on for this. And over here, we'll go one step above celiac intervals for right now. First, we want to find our seventh. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now we want a minor seventh. We have a key signature of G major, so just the F sharp. Our note we started on was a D. D, so we use our D major scale. D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C sharp, D. And so the sharp would be the major, half step lower would be the minor. So without the accent, we shouldn't need the natural sign. Over here, we see a minor seventh once again. We have our seventh. And now we have our key signature with F sharp and C sharp. We have B as our bass tone of the interval. So we can use our B major key signature. So we use our B major key signature. F sharp, C sharp, G sharp, D sharp, and then A sharp. A should be the sharp in the key signature for the major seventh. We'd want to remove that sharp to go down a half step. And last one we'll do on here. We want to make a major sixth. So we've got our sixth. Now we have a B flat in the key signature, which is actually the note we're on right now. So we'll have to watch out, making sure we don't think about this as a natural, but right now this is stating B flat. Now we have our D sharp, and this is where people would say, oh, but I don't know, a D sharp major scale, that's a silly scale. So we can actually flip this around and form a minor third. If I think about this as a B natural right now, I would have B natural up to D sharp, which would be part of my major scale. B natural, C, D sharp, which would make it a minor third. To make it a half step smaller, I would want to make this a B sharp. So that would be that B sharp is 1/2 step smaller, compressing that from a major third to minor third. When I use my rule of 9 and invert a minor third, bringing the B flat back down, it should be a major sixth. Nice. Let's go on to another exercise that doesn't have us involve writing, just identifying. This is going to be interval identification. Make sure we've got both clef signs. We've got our range set. Over here, we can pick however many key signatures you like. We'll go up to 5 for both for right now. And then making sure our require quality is turned on. All of our intervals. Over here, we'll set it back down. We'll start with level 3 to start ourselves off. So we have an interval of a 1, 3, 5 plus 1, 6. So we're in our 6th category, dealing with majors and minors. We have our D sharp in our bass. So we are going up to a B flat. As our key signature, we have a B flat, E flat, and A flat. So we can actually invert this interval to solve this, since we might not be familiar with a D sharp major scale. So we have our B flat, C, D natural would be the major third. We then would have that B expand from the major third to the augmented third with the D sharp. The augmented third would invert to a diminished sixth. Over here, even though they write the D flat first, B is the lower tone. B to D would be our third. Now we have our key signature B flat, E flat, A flat. So we'll use our B major scale with the lower tone. B, C sharp, D sharp. D sharp would be the major third. D natural would be the minor third. And then D flat would be our diminished third. Over here we have a nice another cross staff one that uses ledger lines. We have our 1, 3rd, 5th, 6th. So we're dealing with sixths. We have no sharps or flats in our key signature. And A is our bass tone using our A major scale. A, B, C sharp, D, E, F sharp. F sharp would be the major sixth, F natural the minor sixth, and then F flat the diminished sixth. And just for fun, let's go into the intervals of doom one time, or accidentals of doom. We see our 3 flats in the key signature, B flat, E flat, A flat. We see our bottom tone is a B. Let's watch out, that is the B flat from the key signature. And we have our 1, 3, 5, 7 plus 1, the octave over here. And this one is marked with a B natural. So we have our octave. It's a perfect interval. B flat to B flat would be perfect. The natural expands it by a half step into the augmented. And this will be the last one we do. So over here, this will use a trick we didn't talk about earlier, but it's a pretty simple one. Again, we can say we don't know a D sharp major scale over here, but we don't actually have to know the major scale all the time. We can start by eliminating some sharps. And so I've got my D going up a third to F. So I know I'm in my thirds category right now. And if I was to say that I know my D major scale, D natural, E, F sharp, that would be my major third. And then if this D sharp is making this smaller by contracting this interval by a half step, it would go from major third to minor third. Good. Hopefully this gives you a bunch of fun resources and some problem-solving methods for solving very standard intervals. Most of the intervals you have to come across will be much more simple than this, but especially on tests or on some romantic and contemporary music, it can be a bit tricky solving some of these, and this should give us some good strategies for overcoming accidentals and overcoming wider intervals. Happy practicing.